I voted affirmative. My problem with the way the counterplan went down in the debate is I don't think you have a net benefit. The counterplan doesn't resolve it because these things would be inevitable. They would link to the quo regardless of the action of the counterplan, which generally have uniqueness, and I don't understand how it would be an offensive argument against the app. Representations of global warming will be used regardless. They make a note of your own evidence, which says that since 2003, it's been a component of Pentagon strategy studies, and it seems to be something that will continue regardless of the counterplan, even though the counterplan, which you try to explain, takes note of the fact that these types of representations are bad. There's no connection or causal explanation of why that would suddenly shift the strategies of these military planners. So it seems to be something that is inevitable regardless of the AF or the counterplan for that matter. Yes, I do think you have a secondary impact of an ethics framing, but I think that is fairly underdeveloped in the 2NR. You are making decent answers as to why ethics should precede consequentialism due to the probabilistic nature of predictions and how they relate to making consequences, but I think there is a very poor impact framing for the ethics impact itself. What it is, why it matters, how it outweighs the perceived solvency deficit, which is something else I vote on, is something that is, to me, not sufficiently developed in the 2NR. And I also think there is a solvency deficit with the counterpoint, which is their raw evidence. They continue to explain that there is a need for the injection of doomsday messages regarding global warming into the public consciousness such that there can be a shift in consumption patterns, which is necessary to kind of actualize or take advantage of the technology that would be generated by the banking advantage. So their argument is that the security establishment will use these regardless, but some things like the AF and the reasons and the assumptions for the AF need to be made public so that they can spill over and motivate that change so there could actually be some level of broader solvency to the warming advantage writ large. And I think that the conjunction of the fact that I just don't think there's a unique net benefit to the counterplan and there's some level of a solvency deficit to it makes it easy for me to vote affirmative. But that's my reason.
I think that the combination of the counterplan net benefit outweigh the affirmative/solvency deficit. I don't think the counterplan is competitive. I don't think counterplans based on justifications are legitimate. But kind of once you gave up on that in this debate, I think it puts you in a really tough place. Because the plan inclusive nature of the counterplan solves a lot of your offense. So you say in a lot of places, the banking advantage, or this is the impact of solvency, but my understanding of the counterplan is it solves those things because it legalizes nearly all gambling in the U.S. It just does it for a different reason. And so we do the deal, the companies and the government get the revenue, they invest in the technology, they do all those things they do, solve the mechanism and everything, but they just don't do it for the reason saying that we have to do it to stop climate conflict, and they have some arguments about why saying we should do it for climate conflict is bad. And so normally all of your offense would apply and that the impact of that solvency deficit would outweigh, but because of the abusive nature and because it does so much of your plan minus representations, then I don't think you kind of get any of that offense. I do think that the app has some decent evidence kind of about why doomsdaying is good and why we have to get the public mobilized and everything, but I just thought the negative evidence was better, and it was better in that more specific to climate, more specific to getting success in international organizations, institutions, getting other countries on board. Matt mentioned the consumption argument. That can kind of go both ways because while your approach could help people change their consumptive patterns, an argument for the negative is kind of by doing this for a different reason, we would hopefully try to change the consumptive patterns of the government, who's a large user of fossil fuels through the military and kind of all those things. And so I think a lot of that cuts both ways. But I thought probably the best affirmative evidence was that ROM card that you mentioned, but kind of why about it said it, why, it's wrong to assume that doomsdaying doesn't work, but the evidence was just kind of generic and about warming specifically. The negative evidence was just more specific to scenarios in the military and provided some past examples, talked about why basing a justification on that would actually increase the risk of military intervention, which you said, kind of conflicts, everything are bad, and the kind of specificity of the negative evidence about a successful international process to solve warming, other countries. And so for me, I'm kind of more persuaded about those kind of policy-based net benefits as opposed to this argument about kind of ethics, must reject colonialism, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there's a debate, which is more important, ethics, action, that kind of thing, and that debate is close. But just from kind of a policy impact, I think, because there's really not a solvency deficit, the policy net benefits, including solving better, I think just outweigh a little bit because of the lack of a larger solvency deficit.
How would you make their negotiations evidence which says that dialogue already exists? Like it gives examples as like the Copenhagen, the Paris Accords, and like I think even the Colombia or the South American Accords. But the international community is already saying that extinction exists.
Mm-hmm. Well, and so I think what they're saying is this current strategy that exists is not working.
Yeah, but as I read the counterplan text, it says we should just reject the apps one instance. Why would that spill over to other instances necessary?
Well, there's certainly not 100% that it will spill over to the future, but just, kind of in this debate, we're looking at in a vacuum, voting for this affirmative, should it be done because of climate conflict controversies or not? I agree, kind of the spilling over to the future and all that kind of stuff is very questionable, but for me, the issue is kind of when I'm endorsing the affirmative, whether it should be through the impact scenarios you provided or not, as per their evidence, and there's a chance by, in Congress, we do this policy, and that could cause some kind of shift. Now, I don't think there's a great chance it's going to do it, but I think that's kind of you have an all or nothing argument, and so. And maybe some more time kind of on that or more evidence about, and so it seems like it's failing now, and then I have to take the chance to try to do it under which condition is best, and to me, because of the argument and the evidence, the negative strategy gives me the best chance. I don't think either chance there's a great potential for success, but I think the negative has a little bit more advantage, so I'm going to try it that way, even though probably both are going to fail because of those things you mentioned.
Yeah, the ROM evidence also talks about how it's necessary at the individual level in order to change how individuals consume resources.
Mm-hmm.
How does a counterplan gain access to changing individuals' actions, which I thought the 2AR had an argument as to why individuals would hold governments accountable for.
I guess I maybe agree with the first part a little, but not the second part as much. The kind of the solvency, the connection between individual action and actually solving the harms. I didn't, or pressuring governments. That to me seems a little bit weak. And so maybe some more time on how action can mobilize and cause votes and changes in Congress and different things like that, maybe, but I guess I think under both scenarios that's not likely. And like I mentioned before, that maybe your app does have a better chance of changing personal consumption patterns, but I think the counterplan, the way in which they do it, has a better chance of changing government policies, and neither side really said which side would be more responsible to the problem or solving the future, and maybe I interjected a little bit saying, well, maybe the government's a larger contributor, but that's certainly up for debate. But I think both sides need to take a position on that, so I don't have to try to make that for myself and weighing it. So I think the arguments you're making are good, and there is a deficit. It's just kind of the weighing and comparing which outweighs which, so it's the quicker time frame, how do they reflect to each other. It was a split decision, it was very close. There certainly is paths for victory for both sides. It was just, with a little bit more work in the last rebuttals on those issues, I think it could have been more helpful to all of us.
Yeah, I agree a lot with that decision. I think that there is a distinction between the two different representations that they're criticizing in the 1NC and the representational criticism that they're going for in the 2NR. So I see a lot of your 2AR addressing the question of we need to have, the threat that people are going to die in order to mobilize people for change. And the top of we're sort of close to the top of the 2NR, the argument is you could use apocalyptic rhetoric in order to be able to mobilize people against climate change. We simply should not utilize it as a question of climate conflict between other nations. And then in that speech, there's a couple of representations in the 2NR that he points out directly that are mentioned in the 1NR, stuff where your evidence says that we have to be a green hegemon, stuff where it says that people immigrating from Africa into Europe is going to cause these European wars to develop and stuff like that. Those specific links are about the phrasing of the climate conflict between nations, opposed to just global warming is going to kill us. And so a lot of the evidence that I'm reading for how we get to mobilize individual populations is just talking about how we have to create big threats that are going to put us all in this collective mode where we have to go up and be able to challenge things. they're able to capture that because I go back and read the 1NC pick on the plan, and it says to implement the plan without the climate conflict rhetoric, which means that they could capture all the rest of your evidence. And there are some lines within the evidence that you read that I could potentially say is a defense of climate conflict rhetoric, but you need to really focus on those lines and do the work, because the vast majority of that evidence is just talking about the necessity to have like apocalyptic rhetoric and having the necessity of larger scale impacts, and they're able to capture all that when they're not going for the Finney evidence anymore and stuff like that as well. So I think that what the 2NR does gets out of a lot of different offense. And I looked at their evidence. Their evidence is very good at explaining how when nations view these things as a security issue, it's going to pit them against each other. And China specifically are going to use that as a bargaining chip. If the U.S. uses it as a security issue, now we're going to make sure that we're not going to we're going to ask for more things, and those negotiations aren't going to necessarily work. And it causes nations to securitize their borders, which also leads to more likelihood of war. So it turns those sort of things. So I think the counterplan's able to resolve more of those negative effects than the plan with those sorts of representations. I think that in the 2AR, your best bet is going for sort of the PICS bad justification stuff and the permutation, because that's really the crux of the debate. And you have evidence that indicates that representations don't matter. It doesn't say representations are entirely irrelevant, but at the point that they're doing a plan as well as representations, you have to, when the representations literally have no effect, or you make more of a theory debate for why representations shouldn't be the center. And I think your evidence is pretty good at backing up that those arguments, but I think that that should be the centerpiece of the 2AR, is focusing on the evidence that says that when you have the framework of representations, that elides everything else. You do make that argument in the 2AR, but when you're not going for that with the permutation, it again, like I look at that evidence and doesn't say it's irrelevant, it just says that it prevents discussions of other things, but they're saying very clearly that the way these representations are affecting specific policy implications and the way these things are going down means that there are still sort of a very consequential effect. And so I think that if you take that evidence, utilize it as a permutation, utilize it as reasons for why the PIC justification and the PICs are bad, I think that's a way for you to win the round. I think the 1AR needs to, I mean, it's tough to necessarily predict that they're going to sever out of one of those things and the other one, but that theory argument, you know, there's just a lot dropped in the 1AR on that PICs justification, which, I mean, we make it very hard for the 2AR to be able to go for it. Potentially the conditionality debate is something that you have a little bit better coverage on, but I think that there has to be, like, given that there's essentially 3 potential picks in this round, there's tension between all of them. Like, instead of making multiple theory violations, it might be better in the 2AC to make it a single theory violation with an interpretation that says multiple conditional advocacies that contradict that also are plan inclusive are a reason to reject, and then that way you have more specific justifications for why what they did in this round is bad, opposed to just sort of like PICS general, condo general, you know, and that sort of stuff. And I think that might make it easier for you as they sort of shift the nature of the debate. I also think that you can potentially use maybe some of like the theory arguments that they're pulling on elsewhere in order to be able to potentially use the reasons for why it could justify the things that you're doing as well. And I think that, those are sort of the ways to get back into the debate. Would be what I say. I think the block division is messy, as you say in the 1NR. I think the 2NC takes on a little bit more than you should, so that way your partner can be able to develop the other portions of the argument. I do think you make the smart 2NR choices sort of the way that you are going for things as well. But I think that, you know, the only thing that you're going to be able to lose that pick level on is going to be the question of the permutation, and so I'd have more time spent on there, because you just sort of like fly through that really quick, banking it all on the question of the theory debate on whether or not picks are justified, but you know, because then you bank it on severance, but there's not a lot of reasons for why severance is bad or anything like that, so there is room for them to justify the permutation even with rhetorical advocacies and stuff like that, so your justification's fine, but now when you're picking out of a couple of different lines or different cards, what's the difference between a justification and a word pick, right? Words we use to justify it, but now you struck a whole sentence from their affirmative. Is that now justification or a whole piece of evidence? And so I think that playing on the difference between what constitutes a word pick and a justification is sort of what you would have to do to sort of explain why it would also check back against sort of the permutation and severance issues. And so those would be the holes that I think that you leave open in the 2NR to be able to go for their theory arguments as well as their permutation.
This is kind of for everyone, but like, would I be generically correct that like part of the issue is that like we needed to see earlier that like we needed to go for theory in the 2AR to beat back just the nature of the counterplan. So like 1AR should have just been like, here's the couple solvency deficits, here's what we don't like to stuff, like really fast, and then just like theory stuff.
I think you could also, I think you could also have a defense of sort of realist politics and international relations,
Yeah.
right? Because I think the problem is that the 2AC doesn't have offense against two different levels of representations. It's just the apocalyptic rhetoric, and there's two distinct critiques there. So having sort of, instead of just consequences good, realist approaches to evaluating policy analysis and international relations good, and then you sort of have inroads to sort of be like why, you know, that then creates offense, and why we should have fear-mongering and war-mongering tactics as well, like then gives you offensive balance. But I do think theory could be better developed, but I think that there is other substantial answers you can give.
And I think you got leeway in the 1AR, even if it, you didn't kind of, the coverage wasn't as great as the 2A as you like. I mean, it's like a counter plan that's on a different case page, and it doesn't, it has a text, but it's not a separate off-case argument, so there's some, and so kind of once you realize what it is, I think then it's, and maybe it's a little bit different and bigger of a threat than maybe initially thought, kind of point that out, and that you should get some more leeway to answer it as it kind of morphs throughout the day.
Okay.
Luck.